So in the series of lectures on recent advances in chemical engineering, this is the last lecture. So this lecture will be on process systems engineering. Today's lecture on process systems engineering, giving an overview lecture, will be delivered by my colleague, Professor Yogendra Shastri. Yogendra has his undergraduate training from LIT Nagpur. After that, he joined IIT Bombay for his MTech. He did his MTech in Systems and Control Engineering, and followed by PhD at University of Illinois in USA. Yogendra then proceeded to join University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign as postdoc researcher, and later on he was a research faculty at University of Urbana-Champaign. From there, he moved to IIT Bombay as a faculty about 2 years back. So his research areas are broadly process systems engineering. In particular, he works on large-scale optimization, optimal control, and its variety of applications in different areas. So he'll be talking broadly about process systems engineering and the work that we do in our group, also in particular about his research areas. So I would like to hand over to Professor Yogendra Shastri.
Thanks, Sachin, for the introduction. Good morning to all of you. I hope you have had a good time for the last 2 days. All the lectures, I hope, have been exciting and inspiring. I also am pretty sure that most of you are probably now tired. Your brains are saturated with all the information that is being bombarded for the last 2 days. So I have the unfortunate task of giving you some more gyan for the next 50 minutes or so. But it's also quite appropriate in a way that the talk on process systems engineering is the last one, because as I'll try to emphasize during my talk, the field of PAC, as we call it, is a highly interdisciplinary field. So it has applications in it has applications in all areas of chemical engineering. So all the areas that you have previously heard of, reaction engineering, nanotechnology, biosystems, there are applications of PAC in those areas. So it's quite appropriate that PAC talk is scheduled at the end, so it will emphasize the all-encompassing scope of PAC. Before I get into the research part, I want to spend some time on making sure that all of us understand what PAC is. So I'll start with the definition of a system. Now we use this word system quite often in general vocabulary, but there is a certain definition to it from a research standpoint. What do we call as a system? So the formal definition of a system is that it's an integration of several components that are working together for a certain goal. So the best example of a system is our human body. Now our human body has a lot of different organs. All of them have to work. You cannot have a case where everything else is working fine, but the lungs are not working, or kidneys are not working. That won't be good enough. You won't be able to survive as a human being. In addition to that, all of these organs have to work in sync. So the interrelationships between these different components also becomes important. So the idea in systems engineering or systems theory-based research is to take this holistic view. So if I have to compare what research was presented in the last 2 days, during the last 2 days, you might have realized that the focus was to look at smaller and smaller things. You look at nanoparticles, quantum dots, or when you talk about reaction engineering, you want to understand how the catalyst surface behaves on the micro scale. So that is known as the reductionist approach, and that is what scientists typically take. The idea in systems research is actually exactly opposite. We try to take a holistic view. We want to understand how things work together and what are the interrelationships between the different components. So that is actually a key difference that I must highlight before I start talking about the research part. Another good example is an aeroplane, which again consists of a number of components. So let's start with some examples of systems closer to our discipline, chemical engineering. So one obvious example is a chemical process plant. It consists of different reactors, heat exchangers, separators, pumps and valves and all these things. So these are different components of this whole system. But if you look a little further, if you look at an individual reactor, which is a component of this process plant, the reactor itself is a system. The reactor consists of a stirrer, possibly a heating or cooling jacket, the reactants themselves, there is a control valve and all that. So these are components of a reactor. Going at a still smaller scale, let's say the reaction is a biological reaction. So it includes different biological components, a cell. So cell would be a component of this reactor, but as we all know, cell itself is a component, is a system of different components. So I hope the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that each system is a component in itself, and each component is a system in itself. Okay? And on the other side, you have a process plant could be a part of a production supply chain. So as I said, as we go from this right-hand side to the left-hand side, the spatial and temporal scale is increasing. This is at a very small level, and this is at a very large level, large spatial and temporal scale. So the point here is that, as I said, each system consists of multiple components, and each component is a system in itself. So that is, I hope that clarifies what a system means. So now let's see what systems engineering means. Okay. So the idea in systems engineering is you have a physical space, which in our case is typically a process plant, a process reactor, a production supply chain. So what we do in systems engineering is we perform system abstraction, and I'll explain what that is. Essentially, that is converting the physical system into a set of equations, mathematical equations. Once that is done, we perform different kinds of analysis on that in that information space using those equations, which could be optimization, control, fault diagnosis, state estimation, all these things. And hopefully, once that analysis is done, there is some conclusion, there is some design, or there is some control strategy that is fed back to the actual physical system. So there is this decisions and recommendation step, which is actually very important. There is no point in doing analysis if that is not going to be of any use. Okay, so it's important to connect back to the physical system. So, so this is essentially a summary of what we do in systems engineering. Okay. So as you might have realized, this step of system abstraction is quite critical. If it's not there, you cannot have anything, you cannot do any analysis. So let's see what that is. So it's just another word for modeling. And when I say modeling, I'm not talking about this other kind of modeling, I'm talking about mathematical modeling. So typically these are equations. And this is something that all of us do intuitively without realizing. So let me ask you a question. Tomorrow is 5th of July. I want you to tell me whether it's going to rain in Mumbai or not tomorrow. You can only answer either yes or no. Yes. So I assume most of you are saying yes. So what you have intuitively done is you have looked at historical data. You know, you would have realized, okay, this is the monsoon season, this is Mumbai. It is very likely to rain. So my answer should be yes. So you have essentially developed a very crude empirical data-based model. You have developed what is the first, on the first line there, a data-based or regression model. Okay, you have looked at historical data and you are trying to predict what will happen tomorrow. So that is okay. If the decision, if I ask you the question to make a decision whether I should carry an umbrella or not, that is fine. Even if the decision is wrong, even if your prediction is wrong, it's fine. It's not going to make a huge difference. But let's say if I ask you that based on your answer, ISRO is going to decide whether to send a satellite or not. If it rains, we will not send a satellite. If it doesn't rain, we'll send a satellite. Now what would be your answer? If I am in your place, my answer, I would be very skeptical about giving an answer based on just database models. Okay? I would like to know a little bit more. I would like to know what is happening right now. What are the climate conditions? What are the pressure patterns? What are the wind patterns? So what I am doing is I am asking for a more rigorous mechanistic model. So I have moved from database model to a mechanistic model because my requirement has changed. Okay. So I have listed here different types of model that could be developed. One example, of course, is this mechanistic versus database, static versus dynamic, linear, nonlinear. So there are these different kinds of models that you can develop, and the model selection or what kind of model you want to develop typically depends on what application you have in mind. How do you want to use the model? That is one criteria. Second criteria is what information and resources you have. You might want to develop a mechanistic model, but there is not just enough information. You just don't understand what is happening. So you may have to rely on a database model. Similarly, there might be some situations where a mechanistic model is computationally too complicated. So it's not possible for you to use that model for any purpose. So you may have to compromise on that. So the model selection decision, which is, as I told you, is a very essential step in any systems analysis work, is a key step because the decision depends on what you want to do later on with the model. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is that no model is accurate. I mean, all of us who work on modeling and subsequent analysis can never claim that our model is exactly accurate. That is never possible. The goal is to make or develop a model that is good enough to solve the problems we want to solve. So that is about modeling. So once we have done the modeling step, the next thing is to do analysis. And there are different things you can do here. You can do a simple simulation, which is basically a what-if type of analysis. You have a model, you change the input, you find out what is the output. You can do optimization, you can do control, fault diagnosis, and we'll talk about all these, or most of these things in detail later on. That is what the talk is about, most of the talk is about. And then, of course, once you have done this analysis, I mentioned that there is an important step of taking the decisions back to the physical system. So what are these decisions? From an application standpoint, this could be process design decisions. It could be an optimal flow sheet to produce a certain product. It could be a reactor design. It could be a supply chain network, or it could be sensor design. Okay? From a control standpoint, it could be an on-rail control strategy or how to operate the plant. I also want to emphasize that a lot of our work is focused on developing new methods. So although the motivation is to apply these methods to a certain chemical engineering problems, but these methods have wider applicability. So it could, an example is an optimization algorithm or a solver. So although it has been developed to solve a chemical engineering problem, it will have applications in other areas of engineering or science. So a lot of our work also focuses on developing these new methods. Okay? So I want to go back, I skipped one or two slides. So I talked about systems engineering, but I didn't really talk about what is process systems engineering. Now it's very simple extension. It's applying systems engineering tools to processes involving physical, chemical, and biological processing operations. And I'm sure all of you and all the previous talks have fall in under one of these three categories. Physical, when we talk about complex fluids, Professor Parthasarathy Goswami explained yesterday, or Professor Ratul Das Gupta explained that there is a lot of physical phenomena that comes into picture. The first talk was on biological systems. Chemical, of course, is fairly obvious. So that is process systems engineering, and I have added a component of economics here, if you see at the top on the right, because most of our engineering decisions, for most of these decisions, economics plays an important role. So this is basically, this slide captures the essence of process systems engineering. You have a physical system, you do analysis and pass the decisions back to the physical system. Okay? So I hope you have at least a rough understanding, a rough idea of what PAC is. So now I'll get into some of the research details. What has been happening in the last 10 to 15 years in this area, and what are some of the new frontiers or new challenging problems that would be addressed or that should be addressed in the next 10 to 15 years. And if you have any burning question, please feel free to stop me anytime. So a little bit of history before we go in. So as many of you might be knowing, when chemical engineering started or processing or manufacturing started, most of it was batch processing. And it was very ad hoc. Those were unsafe processes, very inefficient. So the systems engineering or process engineering was not really practiced as we know it today. And Solvay, who developed the ammonia-based soda production process, is probably, or is regarded as the first process engineer, meaning that he applied engineering principles to a problem in chemistry of manufacturing soda. Okay. And a little bit after that, the Haber-Bosch ammonia production process came up. So these two processes are regarded as one of the earliest examples of process engineering, process systems engineering. So that happened till, there were some examples like that between 1960 and 1816 and 1920. After that, there was a waiting period, sort of, between 1920 and 1960. During this period, there was a lot of development in applied mathematics, including optimization algorithms, control theory. A lot of it was motivated by the Second World War. So a lot of development happened during that time. Computers came up. People realized that computers have valuable role to play in these kind of problems. And later on, from 1960 onwards, there has been an explosion. Computing has become cheaper and cheaper. We want to solve larger problems. And therefore, a lot of these areas like process design, synthesis, control, they have become quite popular, aided by all these developments. So as I said, computing is a very important aspect of PAC, and therefore, if I have to sort of summarize the discipline of PAC, it will consist of three areas: chemical engineering, applied mathematics, and computer science. Okay. So now looking at the major research areas, we can look at the research in terms of two perspectives. One is you look at different methods, optimization methods, control methods, state estimation, and all these things. You can also focus on only the applications. So there are different ways of looking at these things. So I have taken the first approach. I will be talking mainly about the tools and how they are applied to different problems. So I'll start with the first very basic thing of modeling and simulation. So I've already said that model building is essentially converting a physical system into a set of equations. And there are different kinds of models. You have steady state models where the equations are algebraic equations, and you have dynamic models where the equations are ODEs, or partial differential equations. And simulation is essentially predicting what might happen if the input changes. Okay. So one of the first applications, or the major application of simple modeling, is to do process simulation. And I'm sure all of you have heard of, and many of you might have worked on simulators like Aspen Plus or HYSYS. So these are flow sheet simulators. So when the flow sheet simulation area was developed, the focus was initially on developing sequential modular approach. So this is actually a process flow sheet of IGCC, internal gasification combined cycle plant. There is a gasifier here, and there are subsequent plants. So in sequential modular approach, what you do is you have equations pertaining to each box. You know the input, you calculate the output, and you go on calculating like that. So can you tell me what could be a potential problem with this kind of approach? Yeah, but there is even a simpler answer, a more straightforward answer. Not time. So if you see, there is a recycle here on the right hand side. So I said that you have set of equations. You know the input, you calculate the output. But now if you look at this recycle, it's not, the pointer is not working very well, but there is a recycle here on the right. Now if you want to calculate this box, you need to know this input, but this input is not known until you process this box. So you cannot actually do this sequentially. There is some problem. So that motivated so that is one of the reasons. Second reason is, if you want to actually optimize your design, let's say you don't want to fix a reactor size. You want to see what reactor size is best. So that becomes a variable. So because it's a variable, I cannot actually process that reaction block. So that actually some of these things motivated the development of what is known as the equation-oriented approach, where you include all your equations and solve them simultaneously. So now you can take care of recycles, you can do design optimization. So most of the recent work has been in the area of developing equation-oriented approaches. So obviously, the major challenge here is to develop better numerical solvers, because these flow sheets can be huge. There could be hundreds of blocks in a single flow sheet. If you look at, let's say, production of ammonia or sulfuric acid, these are huge processes. So you have thousands and hundreds, thousands of equations. So you need very good solvers to solve those equations. The other area of interest where some work is going on in our department is to develop better reactor models. As you know, reactor is the heart of a process plant. It's actually what gives the desired products. And some of these flow sheeting softwares like Aspen Plus, they have the reactor model is not very rigorous. So some work is going on in Professor Moharir's group on developing generalized reactor model using an object-oriented approach, which will be a more accurate model of reactors. You also want to incorporate very accurate thermodynamic data, especially if there are new chemicals like pharmaceutical chemicals or specialty chemicals. The thermodynamic data may not be existing. So there is some work going on making sure that the flow sheet simulation softwares are able to handle these new chemicals and compounds. So this is about flow sheet simulation. Now I told you that this flow sheet is of coal gasification plant. So it's fairly obvious that gasification is a very important component here. And this flow sheet model will not tell me what is happening inside the reactor. There was a question in the last session about hotspots. And Professor Ganesh said that there is no way of finding out whether there is an hotspot. Okay, and he briefly mentioned that you can actually develop a model and find out. So the approach to do that is CFD, or computational fluid dynamics. So the goal here is to go into details of the reactors or processing unit, could be heat exchanger, could be distillation columns, and to understand what are the fluid flow interactions. So in summary, what you essentially do is you discretize the region. What I have shown here is a picture of a stirred tank reactor. There is a stirrer here, and I want to understand what is the mixing profile, whether it's able to achieve, the stirrer is able to achieve good mixing. So I have designed a reactor, and what we do in CFD is we divide the geometry into very small units. And for each of those units, we incorporate the balance, the conservation equations, the Navier-Stokes equations, heat and mass balance equations. And we solve those equations numerically. And with convergence, it gives you it predicts what is the profile of different parameters. So this shows here what is the mixing profile. This is actually, I think, the velocity profile. So similarly, you can get the temperature profile, which may tell you, let's assume that for a moment that this is actually the temperature profile. So looking at this, you can say that, okay, these are the regions where the temperature is very high. So these are the hotspots. Okay. So that is actually the key difference in flow sheet simulation softwares and CFD. CFD allows you to go into details to understand a single equipment better. Obviously, it's computationally more intensive, which is fairly obvious. So there is some work going on in our department. Professor Mahajani is working on CFD modeling of underground coal gasification. I have some preliminary work in the area of modeling photobioreactors. And then there is a very relatively new thing of combining these different philosophies. I want to do a process flow sheet, but I also want a detailed model of a single reactor. So there is this new Cape Open modeling standard that is coming up now, which allows you to enable this model interaction. So it's like going on a rail journey with your own apartment in your coach. So you have the larger flow sheet, but you also have a very detailed process model for a single reactor. So that is another new area in flow sheet modeling or process modeling. Moving on to model development for sustainability. So how many of you have heard of the word sustainability? Yeah. So can you tell me what it is? Close. So the idea is traditionally when process design or process optimization is carried out, we focus mainly on the economic criteria, whether it's profitable or not. But now there is a greater and greater understanding that that may not be good enough. There are undesirable environmental impacts like carbon emission, water pollutants, which can be carcinogenic. So you need to consider these harmful impacts. So these can come under the environmental impacts. In addition, there is also a social or legal aspect. So the idea in sustainable design is to combine all these criteria together and come up with a better design. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I give you two cars. One is based on petrol, a conventional car, and second is based on electric. It's an electric vehicle. Which would be an environmentally friendly vehicle? Okay. So now let's say the electricity that is required to run the car is coming from coal combustion, which has very high ash content, very high sulfur content. Now it's not so obvious. Okay? So you may, if you look at the car itself, if you consider the immediate effects of the car, it's fairly obvious that electric car is more efficient. But when you look at these indirect impacts, it may actually turn out that a car based on IC engine using petrol is more environmentally friendly. But now if I say that, okay, the electricity that is being produced is being produced by burning natural gas, then suddenly electric car becomes more environmentally friendly. So these are not very simple decisions. When you start thinking about these indirect impacts, these decisions become very complicated. So the idea in sustainable design, and it's sometimes called as green engineering or green design, there are different names for it. The idea is to expand the horizon of process design to incorporate these factors. So that is the idea in design for sustainability. The challenges here are how do you quantify environmental impacts? Should global warming potential be considered? Should carbon footprint be considered? There are several other factors. So you need to identify which are the good indicators, how they impact, how they are relevant in my process. So that is the whole focus in this area. Okay. So the another area which I'll very briefly talk about is multi-scale modeling. Professor Malani might have talked about this in his lecture. So the idea here is that you have multiple spatial and temporal scales. So it may probably not very clear here, but the x-axis here is talking about the length scale, and the y-axis is the temporal scale. So you have molecular level phenomena, then you go to the reactor level, then the process plant level, and finally the whole enterprise. So you have activities that are spanning across multiple spatial and temporal scales, and these all are interdependent. So the reaction, although it's happening at a molecular level, it has an impact finally on your profitability. So the objective in multi-scale models is can we actually combine this? Can we actually enable the interactions, or can we enable the connection of these multiple models at different scales? And there are certain challenges with that. How do you actually make these models talk to each other? You might require some model reduction. So I'll give you a quick example that is coming from Professor Patwardhan's work. So this is about vapor deposition, and this first plot that you see on the top is developed by detailed kinetic Monte Carlo simulations, and then he has performed model reduction, which is a simplified model, and you can see that. So the lower plot here is from a reduced model, and you can see that they match fairly well. Okay? The match is fairly well, but the advantage of this reduced model is that it can now be used for control and optimization purpose, which the first model would be very difficult to use for. Okay, so these are kind of issues that typically come up in multi-scale simulations. So this is an upcoming area of modeling and simulation. There are also processes that are inherently stochastic. Do you know what stochastic means? So stochastic means processes that are uncertain. We don't know surely what will happen. The uncertainty could be due to different reasons. The model itself is not well known, the model parameters may not be well known, there might be outside disturbances that are not accounted for. And in some cases, we might actually ignore these factors and go ahead with a deterministic model, but in many cases, we cannot do that. So in that case, you need to develop a stochastic model. So Professor Patwardhan is working on this research, where this is essentially the first equation. If you remove the last term, this is the deterministic part, and this is the stochastic part, which is trying to account for the unmeasured disturbances. And you want to make sure that this additional term that you have in your equation is accurately able to predict the disturbances that actually occur. If that is the case, you can say that your stochastic model is very accurate or fairly accurate. So finding this additional factor, this L matrix here, is what the focus is. You want to determine this L matrix accurately so that your model equation or the model is accurate. So he is focusing on using database tools to do this model development. So that is about modeling. So that actually most of this, there are a lot of slides on modeling because as I told you, it's a very important component of PAC research. The next very important aspect is optimization. And again, this is something that we intuitively use all the time in our daily lives. anything that we do, we try to optimize. If we want to go from one place to another, we want to minimize the cost, but we also want to make sure that there is not a lot of discomfort. We want to buy something, we want to eat out, we always try to optimize things. So the theory of optimization is essentially a systematic way of taking these decisions for more complicated systems, more complicated processes. So you have a certain objective function which you want to minimize or maximize. It could be net present value or minimizing the energy consumption, maximizing efficiency. And then you have your model equations, which we have already talked about. And there are certain constraints. Maybe temperature is your decision variable, but you don't want it to go above a certain value. So that becomes a constraint. That becomes an inequality constraint. You have a certain bound on that variable. So there are constraints of these types. So this is a generic representation of an optimization problem. And there are different kinds of problems depending on whether your equations are linear or non-linear, whether your decisions are continuous or integer decisions. And research here again can be divided into mainly two areas. One is developing or using existing methods to solve new problems. So you have existing solvers that can solve an optimization problem. You want to use those solvers to solve some new problems. There is also a lot of research on developing new algorithms. So these are the two broad categories. So I'll give you two very quick examples of the first option, that is using existing tools to solve new problems. This is coming from my own research, where myself and Professor Bharti are working on optimizing the flow sheet of an algal biorefinery. So you have number of options here to number of strains, number of processing units, number of products to produce, and the goal is to find the optimal process flow sheet. Another application is oil and gas production networks, which is going into more supply chain type of application. You have multiple gas and oil wells that are producing at the same time. You have certain demand to meet. You have limited storage space in between. So you want to optimize your operations accordingly. And there are several applications like this. This is actually one of the most fertile area of research, applying optimization to process synthesis problems and supply chain problems. So there are numerous applications like these. I have just given two examples here. So moving on the method side, if you have simple problems, it's very easy to find a solution. You take the first derivative and you equate it to 0, and that's your solution. A solution of that equation is your optimal point. If you have constraints, then you have KKT conditions, and the solution of those KKT conditions is the optimal point. But in most cases, most realistic problems, that is not possible. So you have to resort to numerical methods. And one of the active research areas is to come up with new numerical methods. And typically the goal is to develop an algorithm that has maximum accuracy. That means you get to the solution as closely as possible and minimize time. That means you get there as soon as possible. So these are generally the two criteria based on which the algorithms are compared. And without going into details, I'll just explain why this is such a fertile field. And the reason is that the problems are of varied types. If you have a nonlinear problem, if you have nonlinear equality constraint, that becomes a non-convex problem, which is very difficult to solve. Linear problems are always easier to solve than nonlinear problems. And there are different types of nonlinearities. So an algorithm that works on problem type A may not work very well on problem type B. So that's why there is a requirement to continue developing new algorithms, new solvers. Similarly, global optimization, which is about solving non-convex problem, is a very active area of research. Mixed integer, linear and non-linear programming. So mixed integer problems are where you have some of the decision variables are integers. They are not continuous. For example, number of trucks or number of reactors. You cannot have 1.5 reactors. You either have 1 or 2. So that makes the problem more complicated from a computational standpoint. So again, if you want to get to the solution faster, you want to develop new methods. Stochastic problem, I've already talked about stochastic processes. So optimization of those processes is more challenging. And large scale problem. What has happened in recent times is that we want to solve larger and larger problems. We want to not only look at the process plant, we want to look at the supply chain, but which means that the problem becomes very large. Some of these problems have millions of constraints and thousands of variables. So you can imagine that from a computational standpoint, it becomes very difficult to solve. And that's why there is a lot of focus on developing these large-scale algorithms or algorithms that can solve large-scale problems. So decomposition is one way of doing it. I will not talk about it. There are several decomposition methods that are already developed, and there is some work going on in Professor Goody's lab in this area. There is also in stochastic optimization, sampling-based approaches have been developed. Some of my earlier work was in this area, but this is again is a very active area of research. Again, I won't go into the details. We can obviously talk later if you are interested. And finally, there is more and more interest in heuristic optimization. And I'm sure you have heard about genetic algorithm, which is a very popular heuristic method. These methods are typically based on some natural phenomena, like evolution in case of genetic algorithm, or annealing in case of simulated annealing. So these methods are more flexible because they don't require gradient information. Therefore, they are more applicable to wider class of problems. But the issue with this is that the optimality is not guaranteed. So you may get a solution, but you cannot claim that that is the best solution. That may not be the optimal solution. So that is one of the problems. And this last one, this spider monkey is actually not I mean, it's an actual algorithm with that name. I didn't know that until yesterday. So moving on to controls, most of you must have taken a course on process control, where you would have studied PID controllers and tuning parameters, maybe frequency domain analysis and all that. But in many cases, that is not good enough, and that's why we want to have, we need to go to the advanced control methods, like optimal control and model predictive control. So model predictive control is one of the most active areas of research in case of advanced control. So the basic difference in this case is you use the model, you use the process model to optimize your control inputs. So you see here in this MPC box, there is a dynamic prediction model which optimizes the inputs, the control inputs, which are then fed to the process. But because your process and the actual process and the model of the process may not match exactly, there might be some difference. And therefore, there is another step of incorporating the plant model mismatch and solving this optimization problem again. So if this is actually a very very common figure in MPC literature, where you have, this is the current time k. So you optimize your, the red is the reference trajectory, you optimize your control input, and this is yellow is the predicted trajectory of your states. So you implement the first control input, which is this one, but then at this step, when you go to the k plus 1th step, you solve another optimization problem, because although what you have predicted may not actually happen, if your model is perfect, you will ultimately follow this red line, yellow line exactly and reach the red line, but that may not happen. There might be a plant model mismatch, which means that your actual output might vary, and therefore you solve another optimization problem. So you essentially are solving multiple optimization problems at each sampling step. The challenge here is, so what I have explained is a very basic idea of MPC, and conceptually it's very simple to understand, but obviously there are several challenges. One challenge is that most of the processes are nonlinear. Okay, so that means the optimization problem that you solve here is a nonlinear problem. And I have already mentioned that nonlinear problems are much more difficult to solve. And this is a control application. That means time is very important. You need to make sure that the problem is solved before the next sampling instance, which could be as small as 1 or 2 seconds. So time is a factor. The process disturbances, there might be unmeasured process disturbances that might impact the process. So how to incorporate those. So these are some of the challenges in this area. So research in this case in Professor Patwardhan's lab, he is working on developing fault tolerant model predictive controllers. So if there is a fault in the system, which is shown here in blue, which is affecting the process, which is not incorporated in the model, how do you develop a model predictive control that will account for these faults? So that is what he is working on. He is also working on cases where the sampling rates are different, And to give you an example, typically the pressure and temperature measurements are available almost at every instance, but quality parameters may not be available because those have to be done offline. The analysis has to be done offline. So the quality parameter, let's say the composition, may be known every half an hour. So these are called as multi-rate systems. So that makes the whole problem of MPC application more difficult. So this is one area that he is working on. Another interesting application is in the area of hybrid dynamic systems. So hybrid systems are where you have two sets of equations, two sets of governing equations for the same system. So if you look at this tank here, as long as the level of the liquid is below HD or lower than HD, this output Q3, where Q3 is coming from, is not really relevant because there is no output. But as soon as HD goes above, or the height goes above HD, the second input comes into picture. So your model equations change. Another example is phase change. If your phase changes from liquid to gas or gas to liquid, your governing equations might change. So if you have to deal with these situations in a dynamic system, that becomes very challenging. So Professor Bhartiya is working in this area, developing control relevant models and using those in model predictive control applications. The fourth area that we'll talk about is fault detection and diagnosis. So there are two things here. One is obviously to know that there is a fault. So you want to place a sensor where you can identify that there is a fault. But typically in a process plant, if there is a fault, there is not a single alarm that is going off. You will have, let's say, 13 or 15 alarms that are going off simultaneously. So finding out what actually is the fault comes under fault diagnosis. So detection is one thing. Detection is just finding out whether there is a fault or not. Diagnosis is finding out what the fault actually is, which is a much more difficult problem. So this is again a very active area of research. So Professor Mani Bhushan in our department is taking he is using the sign directed graph approach, which is, I have shown an example here. This essentially shows the information flow between different nodes. So these nodes could be process units, and these are different connections. So it's fairly obvious that the nodes that are highlighted in yellow are key nodes, because there is a lot of information or there are a lot of inputs to this node. So if you have a sensor here, let's say in node 14, it will be able to identify faults at several other nodes. So that becomes a key node. Similarly, node 16 is a key node. So the goal in fault diagnosis and fault detection is to one of the objectives is to find a sensor network, to identify the optimal network of sensors, so that in minimum number of sensors you get the maximum detection or more accuracy. So this is an area that he is working on. He is using statistical tools or sign directed graphs to do this analysis. Alarm management is another application where he is working on. Again, I won't go into the details here. And there are certain other applications. You want that the fault detection is more precise, it's more reliable, so you can again use optimization tools to optimize your sensor placement. So there are different things you can do. Although one thing I want to highlight here is that if I go back to this network, when I explained this example, I was talking about a process plant, process, and these are processing units and information going from one node to another. But this could very well be a supply chain network. This could very well be a metabolic engineering network, okay, or metabolic network. So the method that is used or method that is developed to analyze this kind of network can very easily be adapted to analyze a completely different kind of system. And that's what I emphasized in the beginning, that PAC is a very interdisciplinary field. The tools that you develop for a certain application may not, need not be used for only that application. They might find applications in completely different fields. So that is one of the advantages and exciting thing about working in PAC. And finally, state estimation. So there are many situations in which you have a process model, you have certain state variables, but you don't know the values of those variables. This is an example. So this picture is of a oil well or gas well, And this, what I've highlighted here red, is actually at the bottom of the ocean. So this is where the drilling is happening, or this is where the gas is coming from. So you can imagine that it will be very difficult to put a sensor there. First of all, it's a very harsh environment. The pressures and temperatures are very high. It's actually, first of all, it's very difficult to go down there and put a sensor. But this is an important parameter. This is an important variable. I want to know the value of this variable, and I cannot put a sensor there. So the goal in state estimation is to estimate the value of this variable using other measurements. So this this is a state space model. So you know the inputs and you know the outputs, which are y, and the goal is to find the estimate the values of all these states x, some of which might be known, some of which may not be known. Okay. So this is an area where Professor Patwardhan and Professor Bhartiya works. Professor Manibhushan also works in this area, and there are different methods again, which are, some of them are applicable only for linear systems, some are applicable for nonlinear systems. Typically, nonlinear systems, as I've said a few times, that once you have nonlinearity in your system, it becomes significantly more complex, significantly more difficult to solve these problems. I just want to make sure that so the system that you have been seeing in your lab visits is actually this heater mixer setup, and Professor Patwardhan has worked in this, has done state estimation using this on this system. So this is one of the applications, or actually a validation of the theory that he develops. So that actually completes a very brief overview of what is the current research, ongoing research, not only in our department, but globally, what are some of the important areas. Now moving ahead, there are several challenges that need to be addressed, and some of them I have already mentioned, like multi-scale modeling is an important area of application, or where development needs to happen. Also developing models that are quantitative as well as qualitative. So using logic-based principles to incorporate those in quantitative models. That is another area of interest. Modeling of hybrid system. In optimization, I've already mentioned that stochastic system, non-convex problems, distributed system, these are some of the upcoming areas where methods need to be developed. You need better algorithms, better solvers to solve these problems. In control, economic MPC is an exciting area, and I will be happy to answer questions later on what these are. In process design, I've mentioned briefly that sustainable process design is a new area. There's a lot of interest in this area. Life cycle impact assessment, input-output analysis, green engineering, these are some of the terms that are commonly used. There is also a greater emphasis on moving towards product design, like new pharmaceutical products, new specialty chemicals. Instead of just designing the process, you want to design products. And there again, some of the systems engineering techniques would be very useful. Process intensification, such as microreactors, and enterprise-wide optimization. So you want to not only look at the process, you want to look at the supply chain, the wider impacts. So these, especially for large companies, they are getting more and more interested in these kind of problems. And some of the new frontiers, relatively new frontiers, are systems biology and complex systems. So you have already had talks on, the first talk was on biological systems. Yesterday, Professor Partha talked about complex fluids. So there, many of the tools that we developed in PSE have applications in these areas. So if you are working on a PS or a chemical engineering problem, you have a lot of opportunities to work on these allied fields of systems biology and complex systems. So with that, I just want to end with some of the myths that are typically I have found with students who are not sure whether to work in PSE or not. So generally, there is a belief that it's only about mathematics. It's not really true. It is true that most of our work is based on mathematics, but it's not only mathematics, and you don't have to be geniuses. I mean, I don't like mathematics, to be honest, but to solve problems I want to solve, I need to learn mathematics, and that's what I do. I know enough math to solve the problems I want to solve. And there is also a notion that you only work on theoretical problems, which is again not true. In fact, I would say it's quite the opposite. there is a lot of opportunities to work on, there are a lot of opportunities to work on very exciting interdisciplinary problems. In my personal opinion, the research is going to be very interdisciplinary in future, and the value of a systems engineer is going to increase. That is, of course, my personal opinion. There is scope to solve a lot of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary problems. So this is a list of all the faculty that work in this area in our department. Some of them have most of their work in systems engineering, PSE. Some of the other faculty have allied research, or they have, there is one topic that they are working on. And with that, thank you, and I hope I have managed to give you at least a brief idea of what PSE is all about. I hope I have managed to get you excited about this area. It's a really exciting area to work in. And if you are not interested in chemical engineering research, there are other applications that you might be interested in, and this is one such area. Thank you.
Okay, so see, when you actually model a system, okay, you have to represent what is happening in the reality, right? Now, many times it is not very convenient to be exactly close to the reality when you start doing a model. Okay, initially you might do a simplified model, and then slowly you can make it more complex. And see, for example, if you go to some chemical plant, and if you look at the charts of measurements that are coming to the, you will see that they are not some. If you look at some flows, say flows to the reactor or flows to the distillation column, they are not perfectly constant. They are fluctuating all over. But whereas when you look at your books, okay, when you do a design for a distillation column or for a reactor, you make an assumption that there is some constant flow, okay, and for this particular constant flow, I'm going to design this reactor or this distillation column or this section of the plant. In reality, it is not constant. In reality, it might be fluctuating. Okay. So at one level, it is it's convenient and enough to make an assumption that there are no fluctuations. Okay, and you can take some average or mean value and do a design of the system. Okay, so I would call this model in some sense a deterministic model. You are not taking into account fluctuations. Okay, now these fluctuations, if you look at those data, then those fluctuations have two parts into it. One part is there is some slow signal which is changing, and there are some very random large fluctuations. Okay. Now this random fluctuations can be modeled through using probabilistic models. Okay. So I can say that the fluctuation in a particular variable is modeled as a Gaussian random variable. Okay. It has mean is this and standard deviation is this. Okay. Now, just like you can model a single variable using some mean and standard deviation, okay, you can have a differential equation, okay, which is subjected to inputs that are random, not necessarily deterministic. Okay. So stochastic modeling comes into picture when you want to actually take into consideration effects which are random. Okay, and there are situations where you want to account for them. For example, if I am doing this area of state estimation, which Professor Shastri talked about. See, this is about what is called as a soft sensing. So I have a model of a plant which is running online, okay, and I want to actually estimate parameters which are not measurable. See, for example, concentration of some species may not be measurable online, but I'm measuring temperature, pressure, some other viscosity, some other things which I can actually measure. Okay. and then I want to use this data together with my differential equation model to create a sensor, online sensor. Now the data which is coming is noisy. It has, it has a lot of random information. It also has actual information. So I am forced to look at a stochastic model. I am forced to develop a model which takes into consideration randomness in the signal, okay, and then come up with estimate of unmeasured quantities. Okay, so that is where these stochastic models come into picture. There are a variety of situations where you might use stochastic models. You might use even stochastic models to understand some underlying basic phenomena in catalysis. So you might say that, well, I'm going to bombard some species in a stochastic manner, in a random manner on a surface, and I want to see how they adsorb and where the reaction occurs. Okay, so stochastic modeling can be used at variety of levels. It could be used in control for online, dealing with online data. It can be used in simulations. Okay, in PSE, in systems engineering, it is used in it could be used in optimization. Okay, so it is a useful tool to look at certain class of problems. In certain class of problems, it's good enough to do with deterministic models. We don't worry about stochasticity. Okay, we just look at some average properties. Okay, and yeah, Professor Sharad Bhartiya, I think Yogendra talked about his work, and Sharad works on systems biology, and maybe you can say something about just 2 minutes about your work.
So my work is in the area of systems engineering, and I've not limited myself to any areas, things that are interesting. I like to work in those. So some of the areas that I've been working in are systems biology, and then I have also been looking at MPC as one of the control philosophies for control of hybrid systems. Recently I've started working with on state estimation with Professor Mani Bhushan, where we look at state estimation of nonlinear systems. So, but I don't think of myself as working in some fixed fields, but whatever is interesting. So after Yogendra joined us and he started talking about problems in area of biofuels, so that is another area that I've just started working on.
Multivariable control systems. Okay, so we have been working, both of us, myself and Professor Bhartiya, we have been looking at this area called model predictive control. I think there was a brief introduction to that in today's talk. So this is something like online model-based control, okay, where you use a dynamic model to do online forecasting. Okay, so say I have a model for a reactor, and since we have nowadays very, very powerful computers, you can use these computers to foresee what's going to happen if you take some action. Okay, so just like when you are doing things in day-to-day life, let's say you are driving a vehicle, okay, you continuously keep doing what-if scenario simulation in your mind. What if I press the brake now? What if I accelerate? What if, okay, and then you actually select among the multiple choices. You select the best one that you think should be taken, right? That's what you do when you are actually driving a vehicle. So in your mind, in your computer, brain computer, a model is running. Okay, it is actually forecasting scenarios. Okay, and it's trying to find out the best possible solution to the driving problem. Okay, the same thing is now done in multivariable control of chemical plants. So you have a dynamic model for the plant. This model could be transfer function model. It could be nonlinear differential equations, which you write from physics, which you write from your chemical engineering principles, energy balance, material balance. Okay. This model is used online in a powerful computer to do forecasting over a window of time in the future. Okay. So you forecast what's going to happen over next 15 minutes, next 1 hour, next 2 hours. Okay. And you try different scenarios. What if I increase this flow rate? What if I decrease, steam? What if I? So we optimize. We actually, by looking at multiple scenario simulations, we come up with the best scenario or best input that should be implemented. We implement that input, move ahead in time, again do forecasting over the future horizon. So this is called moving window control. Okay. This is something that we have been working on for quite some time, almost now 10 to 15 years on. This is something which is industrially implemented, used. So this is not something which is in air. This technology is been used in the chemical industry for the last 30 years. In fact, its use started in chemical engineering, and all the pioneering work was done by chemical engineers in this particular area. And now there are huge controllers, industrial controllers, like, the largest one is about 600 outputs and 280 inputs. The size of the multi-variable controller is 600 outputs being simultaneously monitored by manipulating 280 inputs. Okay. So we look at, improving efficiency, computational efficiency of this, modeling efficiency or modeling part of it. Okay. Or, under what conditions you will get guaranteed stability of the controller. So we look at variety of aspects of this kind of multi-variable control schemes. We have also been looking at some other nonlinear controllers, like adaptive controllers, like globally linearizing control schemes, and so on. So there are many methods which are. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So the first question, it depends on a lot of things. If you remember when I was talking about the modeling part, I told you that there are different models like linear, non-linear, and when I was talking about the optimization methods, I talked about different types of formulations like mixed integer, linear, non-linear. So it depends on what kind of problem you have you want to solve. So the solver, I assume your question is about solvers. So it depends on those things. So there are certain class of solvers. There are certain solvers that work on most problems quite well, but very often you have some special class of problems for which the algorithm won't work. So then you have to you may have to develop a new algorithm or select an algorithm that works on those kind of problems. For example, there are certain class of problems. So if you have a quadratic problem, then a Newton method would give you solution in one iteration, but it may not work for some other class of problems. For that, you need to go to conjugate gradient method. So there is no rule to it. It depends on several things, the kind of problem you have and the problem properties. Does that answer the question? Yeah. So control maybe.
No, he has one more question, so we'll answer that. I'll ask Professor Bhartiya to answer that question, but before that, I'll just say one more thing. That there are so many methods, right, for optimization. And finally, as you will, if you actually start using it in different problems, that you will realize that you need to develop certain kind of expertise to, you know, to use them in different context. So it's like, you know, you have, it's like a doctor who has many tablets in his, you know, box, and depending upon the patient, okay, he will choose which tablet to administer. Okay, so this is good and bad. You know, if there was one method which would solve all the problems, okay, we would be in difficulty. You know, then there will be a computer sitting and doing everything. So you need this quote unquote expertise to you know, administer the drug, and which is important. That's why all of us are in business. Okay. About the MPC question, I think.
Okay, I'll try to answer your second question. So if you see, most of the processes are classified as either continuous or batch. Now let's come to continuous processes, where there's a lot of control intervention that is possible. So in continuous processes, as you rightly pointed out, that there will be a startup, a shutdown, and hopefully then the plant will work at some operating point forever. But that doesn't happen. There's always a shutdown, maintenance, other issues, so on. So you are also right that most of the time when you talk about controls, you start, so there is an auto mode and a manual mode, and you go to the auto mode when you have come to your point, you know, you're in the vicinity of your operating point. Now, there is a reason why that is the case, and then there is something that would be desirable. The reason why that is the case is, as you know, we talked about modeling here, and we said there are a variety of models. Right from first principles, you look at the multi-scale, at the different scales of the models. Now, there are because if you are talking of control, where let's say the sampling time is 1 second or 1 minute, you will be forced to work with simpler models so that your online optimization, which is happening, can be completed in 1 second or in a fraction of that sampling time. So we therefore end up using models which are simpler. So the point is that if I am already at an operating point, and I'm talking about at a fixed operating point, and I'm talking about small excursions from that fixed operating point, I can use simpler models, okay? And so it is, in practice, that is the case. But the philosophy of control does not preclude using other models. So the practical difficulty is that if I were to use a detail with CFD and so on and so forth, or a more detailed process model, and try to put it into that operating, into my control framework, where I have to finish the optimization in 1 second, it may not be possible. So that is where, again, optimization algorithms, faster computers, and all come and play a role. Now, what is actually done in startup and shutdown is you put it in manual, okay, and hopefully you have a standard operating policy on how do you go through that startup procedure, because you are going through you are going to be transiting through a large part of that space, operating space, to go from completely the plant is stopped and you're trying to go to your desired operating point. Very often these standard operating policies come from operator experience, who says, okay, now let me take this temperature to 25 degrees, okay, now let me close this valve, open that valve, and slowly, you know, ramp myself up to that desired operating point. Currently, when we have like Aspen-based models and more detailed models, we use optimization and try to find out what is that optimal startup policy. So we've gone away from just experience-based to more model-driven and optimization-driven operating policies. Now, it is possible to be able to incorporate those optimal policies through an MPC kind of a framework, and that is increasingly happening. Maybe for simpler systems now, but that is what the future holds. And so these are in some sense the operating policy, which is based on optimization of a detailed process model, is happening offline. And once I've determined what is that operating policy, I implement it online through an MPC kind of a framework. So these are some of the issues that are there. So I do believe that for simpler plants, or at least for in the research domain, we are talking about using controls for startups and shutdowns as well. So I can give you an example of a solar power plant, which IIT Bombay has built in Delhi. And in that case, there's a cloud cover. We don't have enough hot oil to keep the plant running. We have to stop it. It has to be shut down. And then, the clouds have moved on, we may need to start it. So there might be a warm startup, there might be a cold startup, and so on and so forth. You want to add something?
No, and well, what I'm aware of is that it's being used for something close to a startup shutdown, in the sense that it's being used for grade transitions. Okay, suppose in polymer processing, many times you change the grade of the polymer. For you move to some other component, and then you want to shift the system from one grade to other grade. So this is being done through nonlinear MPC. The difference is that the models used here are no longer simple linear approximations. These are first principle models coming from physics, because they can predict system behavior over a large range, and these models are used. Only thing is, I don't think it is still a technology which is sold off the shelf. It is being done. ExxonMobil, for example, does reactor grade transition through a nonlinear model predictive control. So there are these isolated industrial examples where it is being done, but I don't think it is yet come to a point where every process will be started on MPC. That will take time. The issues are computational, and the one is computational issue. The second is having a good model during startup is not an easy thing. Yeah, you had some question.
So as I mentioned, this comes under the heuristic method, and the goal in heuristic method is to mimic some natural process. So in genetic algorithms, for example, the analogy is that as we evolve, we have become more, our functions have been optimized through genetic modification. So only those fitter have survived, and that analogy is used for optimization. So in simulated annealing, the analogy is used is that of annealing. So in an annealing process, you gradually reduce the temperature so that you attain the minimum energy status, and you want to make that change very slowly, because the energy profiles that you get are very, if you will think of it in mathematical terms, it's a non-convex profile. There are sudden dips, and then there is a minimum, and then again. But in the end, for a good annealing process to happen, you need to reach that minimum energy state. So in simulated annealing algorithm, the idea is to look at this energy as a proxy for objective function, or objective function as a proxy for energy, and the temperature is sort of as a proxy for a decision variable. So if your decision variable is a certain system variable, then you change that gradually so that your energy is without going into the detail, there is certain thing called as Metropolis criteria. So I can give you the details later on. So it's used. So the analogy is so we only use the analogy. So in actual reality, we are not talking about temperature. So the temperature is, we think of decision variable as a temperature in case of an annealing process. So what was your question? No, the immediate question, I sort of lost the track. Temperature.
Can you use it only for temperature process?
No.
What if it is isothermal process?
So it does. So your decision variable, it doesn't have to be temperature. Your decision variable could be anything. So in annealing process, physical annealing process, temperature is your control variable. In your physical process, it could be other thing, pressure or other things. So these heuristic methods are more used for solving non-convex problems. That's where they have been used more often, and also in cases where it's difficult to calculate the gradient computationally, it's difficult to do that. Then many of these methods don't require gradient information, so it becomes easier that way.
Well, this EKF can be used for large number of variables. You see, whether you can use EKF or UKF, see these, which type of filter to use, you know, what I would say is that in terms of computational, you know, complexity, I think EKF is probably one of the simplest algorithms, simplest extensions. So, given some problem, I wouldn't go for a more complex algorithm unless there is a need for it. If EKF is working, why should I, you know. Now, the extended Kalman filtering will not work only under, you know, typically for a small class of systems which show some abnormal behavior. Okay. So, if you are not, see, it's like, you know, a very advanced controller might be required when, you know, some part of the plant is very complex and difficult to control. At other things, you can still use PID controller. Okay. So, I would use an EKF when, even if it is large system, if it is not sufficiently nonlinear, if it is not causing a problem, it should work. You know, the problem might come in some tricky systems where you might need to use unscented Kalman filtering. You want to add something?
So you should say about your gradients, no? Like you have applied it to.
Yeah, for example, I have applied it to a reactive distillation system. Okay, it's about 180 states, differential algebraic equations, and we found that with some tweaking, we are able to make EKF work very well for this system, almost comparable to UKF. Of course, UKF does perform better than EKF, but the computation time or the computational resources required are far, far more. You know, almost 80 times more computation time it requires. So it is justified only if you really need it. Otherwise, not really.
So actually, Professor Patwardhan has also applied it to a case where the system is a hybrid dynamic system. So you cannot take gradients, or taking gradients can be ill-conditioned. So in that case, he has applied UKF because you cannot apply EKF. So there could be a case like that where gradient computation is an issue, and so you cannot apply EKF. Whereas in UKF is a gradient-free approach. So he has actually applied it to such a processes as well.
Yeah, so in some situation, the model structure is such that you cannot apply EKF. So, and you have to go for UKF. So that is where. So I think we'll continue this discussion over lunch. We have a small presentation here from for 15 minutes on a project called Virtual Labs. I don't know, you may not have heard about this, but we just wanted to introduce you to this project, which is a new project from Ministry of Human Resources and MHRD. So I think Rupak will give you a brief introduction to this. We'll hand it over to him, and then we'll go for lunch.
Forms or a chemical process. So we have these examples of labs.
So these are labs, but there are some problems with it.
So the problems are like, so you know that when you do a physical experiment in a lab, will definitely not be, this lab will definitely not be available to you 24 hours, right? Like for example, if you are using some tool to do an experiment, for example, MATLAB, your college or institute may not have enough copy of MATLAB to be available for all of you at the same time. So this is one typical problem which you can identify. Then secondly is like the tools that you use in a lab are typically expensive. So the institute will not allow you to do many experiments with that expensive tool. So your accessibility to that lab is limited. Then few equipments are hazardous, like so you can't actually expose yourself to that system for too long. Then
so there is a solution for this problem. So Ministry of Human Resources and Development came up with a collaboration of many institutes to form something called as virtual labs. So we have developed something called as virtual labs. it's an initiative of Ministry of Human Resource and Development. So we'll just see what is virtual labs. So we have virtual labs, two types. So one of the lab is called as modeling and simulation lab. Now Professor Patwardhan was talking about simulations, right? Imagine in a scenario where you can actually simulate the experiments before you actually go into the laboratory condition, the real experiments. So here you can learn through interactive animations built up by animators with the help of professors and students. You have something called as remote trigger lab. Now remote trigger lab is something, there is an equipment, a very high costly equipment which not every college can afford, and there are some other equipments also which are kept somewhere in some part of laboratory in some part of India, and you're actually accessing and doing the experiments on those instruments from your laptop, from your desktop, wherever you are. You can even do it from your mobiles, from Akash tablets. So we'll just see what are these virtual labs.
So this is, you can see that we have a snapshot of typical simulation labs. So you can see some reactions happening. I have an oxygen cylinder over there, and then some readings have been taken. Then in the other part, I have a pipeline going through, some processes running. So this is how a simulation experiment will look like to you. So for example, like you may have this process actually in your lab, okay? But not all colleges can have this equipment, in their place. So colleges which do not have, they can have simulations of this type. Next.
So you have something called as like remote trigger lab. So you will have a fermenter or a bioprocess control which is going on. You can monitor the data in the real time. You can import the data. You can export the data, and you can actually get the all the results you need for an experiment. So this is one common portal which is provided by the MHRD, that is vlabs.co.in.
You can note it down.
It's free of cost. You can go online. You can go on this portal and you can access the labs. That's vlab.co.in. Now, when I'm talking about fermenters and all, it is just not limited to one subject. I hope you're noting down the URL. Okay. So we have physical sciences, biomedical engineering and sciences, computer sciences, electronics. So you have many streams of sciences getting connected through virtual labs. And we have also, you can see the number of experiments you have. So there are various experiments where you can go and perform. So what is its benefit for teachers? It provides an aid for explanation for teaching, and it is also with the curriculum. Okay, it goes side by side with the curriculum, so it is not something you're learning out of your syllabus. For students, it motivates them, it interests. So for example, you are sitting somewhere and your college is closed today, Saturday, Sunday, and you want to do some experiment, and Monday is your exam, your Viva, tutorials, anything, and you can actually do it online. You can do the entire experiment. And so it gives you quality learning because it has been built by the IITs, the NITs, and with the professors. So you have everything, all the data is very good. And you can learn at your own pace. In a classroom, not everyone learns together at the same time. Some people understand later on the things, so you go home, you learn it on your own pace. And evaluation. So there is something called a self-evaluation. Now there are tests also. When you go onto the portal of vlabs.co.in, we'll find you go to an experiment, you click on the experiment, you perform the experiment, then there is a test also where you can see how you are performing. So every time you learn an experiment, you also evaluate yourself. So how this stuff works?
So this is a brief, overview of how does a remote triggered lab works. So now when I say something called as remote trigger, what I mean is like there is an equipment actually sitting somewhere at a remote location. For example, like IIT Bombay has good laboratories, so we have good lab facilities. But colleges, remote locations, they don't have these good facilities. So how does one actually accesses a lab sitting at a remote location? So this is on the left side, you have a physical laboratory somewhere in some part of the globe, and then you have this huge gap of internet, between you and the lab, and then you are the remote user over there. So you will be typically running some tools on a computer, which will help you get connected to the lab sitting somewhere at a remote location. And yeah. So this is the next part where this is how we develop this. So we have everything in a loop, and everything gets evaluated on as the time passes. And things get developed. So it starts with lab developers, with the virtual labs, sorry, and then you have technical evaluation. You get evaluated yourself, and then you feedback to the developers back again that, hey, this stuff doesn't work, or we need some more inputs on this stuff. And then we develop, and the lab gets improved. Then we also conduct field trials. Field trials means what? We actually go and do some workshops across the country, make people familiar with the various labs, give them hands-on trainings, and then they give us some feedbacks, teachers' feedback or student feedback, and then the lab gets developed as a period of time. And there is one important point I would like to say, that whatever tools we use with this interface, they are all free and open source. Okay, we do not use any proprietary tool. To name a few, we do not use MATLAB, we do not use LabVIEW. We use all open source equivalent, which are on par with as far as the performance is concerned. So as a student, as a user, you are not paying anything. This is entirely for free. So how many of you have a copy of MATLAB at their home? Own copy of MATLAB, purchased copy? Nobody has, okay. So imagine how will you do an experiment sitting at a home without MATLAB? So we have open source equivalents to them, like Scilab. It is a very good open source equivalent to MATLAB. So we use Scilab so that you can install a copy of Scilab in your own computer, personal computer, and use it.
So you can see that all we do is very thoroughly checked, and therefore what we deliver is of a very high quality. So you are not just learning anything. It is not just a YouTube video. It is not just any animation by some animator, but it is scientifically designed with par with the education, with the syllabus. So this is the result what we have got in the last year, that we have trained over 50,000 students all over the country. Over 1,000 faculties have been trained. 100 colleges have undergone the field trial, and 36 workshops has been conducted. So I hope that you want to be part of this virtual lab, your college wants to be part of virtual lab. This is the feedback we get from the students. You have many satisfied students, those who want the virtual labs in their colleges. So if you want to be a part of this virtual lab, this is how it goes. So we conduct workshops. We come to your colleges, we conduct workshops, we invite the expression of the interest for being something called as nodal center. Now, if your college becomes a nodal center, then you can actually design your own experiments. So today you feel that, okay, for this experiment, you should have a virtual lab. You build up your team, get with the IT people and com science students in your college, form a team, develop a virtual lab. IIT Bombay gives you the technological help and some financial support to conduct workshop. So you can, as a nodal center, you can actually, your college can be on the map of MHRD, on the national map, that you are doing something really nice. And we get, and the students, as students can undertake these projects as a part of their curriculum projects. And in this way, you can actually not only learn, but your college also helps to learn other colleges and schools which are in the nearby area. So virtual lab is actually a very good tool which you can study along with your practical experiments. It is not just the absolute thing, but of course it helps a lot. Any questions you have got? Yeah.
Suppose I have developed a microplastic and I have applied it to a textile. Now I don't have an SEM facility in my college. So will this help me?
Yeah, any college in this world, you can say, who has this facility, and if they are collaborating with us, making the virtual lab out of it, like anybody can use that facility from anywhere. This is the beauty of it.
How will I use it? What will be the process? I have the sample.
You're talking about physical experiments. Physical experiments. So when it comes to, so you're talking about the category of remote period laboratory, where an experimental equipment is actually sitting there, not just simulation. You're actually doing it on some equipment. So now that depends on the hosting institute, like how much facility that the institute is providing. Yeah.
What she is saying is she's done the experiment.
Okay.
She wants to do characterization of some sample.
Okay.
So she'll need to physically send the
Physically send a sample. Okay.
her sample.
Yeah, of course. I mean, these are like critical domains, I can say. Yeah, where.
This is more geared as of now towards teaching
Yes.
as an aid.
It's a learning aid.
What you are saying is like a research thing.
Research thing, yeah.
Researchers can, of course, use it for simulations. Before you actually send your samples, you can actually simulate something.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about some high-tech equipment which your college doesn't have, and if you're a nodal center, for example, we have partnering institutes. So some college may have some equipment, some college may have. So we are sharing the resources together, and then we are developing a front end where you can actually, the front end and back end together works to perform the experiment.
But physical exchange of things can't be online. Yeah. So we can have flash-based animations for such kind of things where people can learn out of these animations and then go and do the real experiment. Any other questions?
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.